The air was thick with the acrid scent of burning metal and ionized plasma. The once pristine corridors of the Elysium station were now a labyrinth of shattered glass, sparking conduits, and the eerie silence of a place that had once teemed with life. Lyra's breaths came in ragged gasps as she stumbled through the wreckage, her once impeccable combat suit now scorched and torn. Her strength was gone. Every step felt like a battle against the crushing weight of gravity itself. She had been running for what felt like hours, though it could have been mere minutes. Time had lost all meaning in the chaos. The station was under attack, and she was one of the last survivors. The others, her crew, her friends, were gone, swallowed by the void or torn apart by the relentless machines that had breached the station's defenses. The machines were unlike anything she had ever seen, sleek, black, and utterly silent, their movements precise and calculated. They were hunters, and she was their prey. Lyra's vision blurred as she rounded a corner, her legs giving out beneath her. She collapsed against a bulkhead, her chest heaving. Her hand instinctively went to the wound on her side, where a shard of metal had embedded itself during the initial explosion. Blood seeped through her fingers, warm and sticky. She was losing too much of it, too fast. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the distant hum of the station's failing systems. "Not like this. Not here." She had always imagined her death would come in the heat of battle, fighting for something greater than herself, not cowering in the shadows, alone and forgotten. But the machines were relentless, and she was just one woman, one broken, bleeding woman. Her comms were dead. The station's systems were failing, and her suit's power was nearly depleted. She had no weapons, no allies, and no hope. But she refused to give up. Not yet. With a groan, she pushed herself to her feet, leaning heavily against the wall for support. She had to keep moving. She had to find a way out. There had to be something, anything, that could help her survive. The corridor ahead was dark, the emergency lights flickering weakly. She could hear the faint hum of the machines in the distance, their presence like a shadow creeping ever closer. She forced herself to move, each step a battle against the pain and exhaustion that threatened to consume her. But it was no use. Her legs gave out again, and she felt her knees, her vision swimming. She tried to scream, to call for help, but her voice was little more than a hoarse whisper. No one would hear her. No one was left. And then, just as the darkness began to close in around her, she heard it. A sound that didn't belong. Footsteps. Human footsteps. "Hello," she croaked, her voice barely audible. "Is someone there?" The footsteps grew louder, more urgent. And then, just as she was about to collapse, a figure emerged from the shadows. A man. Human. His face was streaked with grime, his clothes torn and bloodied, but his eyes were sharp and focused. He moved with purpose, his movements quick and efficient. "Hold on," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I've got you." Lyra's vision blurred as he knelt beside her, his hands moving quickly to assess her injuries. She tried to speak, to tell him to run, to save himself, but the words wouldn't come. The pain was too much. "You're going to be okay," he said, his voice steady. "Just hang on." And then, just as the machines closed in around them, he scooped her up in his arms and ran. The man's name was Kale. He was a scavenger, a lone wolf who had been on the station when the attack began. He had been hiding, surviving, waiting for an opportunity to escape. And then he had heard her scream. "You're lucky I found you," he said as he worked to stabilize her injuries in a makeshift med bay he had set up in one of the station's abandoned labs. "Another minute, and you'd have been scrap metal." Lyra winced as he applied a fresh bandage to her side. "Why did you save me?" she asked, her voice weak but steady. "You could have left me. You could have saved yourself." Cale paused, his hand stilling for a moment. "Because you're human," he said simply. "And in a place like this, that's reason enough." Lyra didn't know what to say to that. She had spent so long fighting, surviving, that she had almost forgotten what it meant to be human. To care, to hope. "We need to get out of here," Cale said, breaking the silence. "The station's systems are failing, and those machines aren't going to stop until they've wiped out every last trace of us." Lyra nodded, pushing herself up onto her elbows. "Do you have a plan?" Cale's lips curved into a faint smile. "I always have a plan." The plan was simple. Get to the hangar, find a ship, and get the hell out of there. But simple didn't mean easy. The station was a maze of death traps, and the machines were everywhere. They moved in packs, their glowing red eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of life. Cale led the way, his movements quick and precise. He seemed to know the station like the back of his hand, navigating the corridors with an ease that Lyra could only envy. She followed as best she could, her injuries slowing her down but not stopping her. She refused to be a burden, not after everything he had done for her. They moved in silence, their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust and debris that covered the floor. The only sounds were the distant hum of the machines and the occasional creak of the station's failing infrastructure. And then, just as they reached the hangar, the machines found them. They came out of nowhere, their sleek black forms materializing from the shadows like ghosts. Cale reacted instantly, shoving Lyra behind him and drawing a plasma pistol from his belt. The air crackled with energy as he fired, the shots tearing through the machines with deadly precision. "Run!" he shouted, his voice barely audible over the din of battle. "Get to the ship." Lyra hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to stay, to fight. But she knew she would only be in the way. She turned and ran, her legs screaming in protest as she pushed herself to her limits. The hangar was a nightmare of twisted metal and shattered glass. The ships that had once been docked there were now little more than smoldering wrecks. But there, at the far end of the bay, was a single ship that looked relatively intact. It was small, barely more than a shuttle, but it was their only hope. Lyra reached the ship just as the sound of Cale's plasma pistol fell silent. She turned, her heart pounding in her chest, just in time to see him sprinting toward her, a swarm of machines hot on his heels. "Get in," he shouted, his voice drained. Lyra didn't need to be told twice. She scrambled into the ship, her hands flying over the controls as she tried to get the engines online. Cale leapt in after her, slamming the hatch shut just as the machines reached them. The ship shuddered as the engines roared to life, the sound deafening in the confined space. Lyra gripped the controls, her hands trembling as she guided the ship out of the hangar and into the void of space. The machines didn't follow. They couldn't. But the station was another matter. As they pulled away, Lyra could see the massive structure beginning to collapse in on itself, the weight of its own destruction too much to bear. "We made it," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the engines. Cale didn't respond. He was slumped in the co-pilot's seat, his breathing shallow and labored. Lyra's heart sank as she saw the blood seeping through his shirt. "Cale!" she cried, her voice breaking. "Hold on. We're going to get you help." But Cale just shook his head, a faint smile playing on his lips. "You're going to be okay," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "That's all that matters." And then, as the station exploded behind them, Cale closed his eyes and let out his last breath. Lyra didn't know how long she sat there, staring at Cale's lifeless body. The grief was overwhelming, a weight that threatened to crush her. But she couldn't give in to it. Not yet. She had to survive. For him. For all of them. With trembling hands, she set a course for the nearest colony. It would be a long journey, but she had time. And she had hope. As the ship hurtled through the void, Lyra allowed herself a moment to grieve, to remember the man who had saved her life, even at the cost of his own. And then, with a deep breath, she wiped away her tears and focused on the path ahead. The galaxy was a dangerous place, but she was still alive. And as long as she was alive, there was hope. And that was enough.